All right, so this tutorial is going to cover working from 3D model, develop 2D orthographic drawings in Rhino. And I'm going to start with this model right here, which I already have of a little kind of pavilion structure that's made out of these rotating strips. And I'm going to kind of show you how to go through and set up views and pull off drawings and then edit the drawings. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about um, how to produce like a clipping of a view in Rhino. So, for the most part, if you're doing a site plan, or if you're doing an elevation or something like that, you can use the regular kind of world view projections of your different viewports. So top view obviously would be our site plan. We can go to set view. We can go to left. We can go to right, front and back, obviously. And then basically, this is the kind of view from which you can pull an orthographic drawing. But before I do that, I'll also explain when you're drawing a model that's been cut away, so like a plan, like a floor plan or a section, you would want to, before you make the drawing in one of these views, you would want to make what's called a clipping plane. So type in that command, clipping plane, press enter on the keyboard, and basically you can draw a physical plane anywhere in Rhino space. So if we were drawing a section, we could use this option to draw it in a vertical orientation. If I was drawing a plan, I could just draw it in the kind of world XY plane. And I can reposition this plane, and it's going to give me a live clipped view of my model. So for example, like in a standard height for this would be 4 feet if we're looking at a floor plan. So that could be, maybe the height of our plan. Of course, many of the structures here will be less traditional, so you could feel free to use a height that makes sense for you. For this one, it probably makes sense to show all the way down to where we're cutting through so we can get a sense of the interior of the space. The other thing to note about clipping planes is that they are specific to each viewport. And what that means is if I go to front view, you can see that in this viewport, my model is not clipped away. It's not cut. And so when I have a clipping plane selected and I go to properties and I click on this little button, clipping plane, I can turn the clipping plane on and off in each viewport, and it will clip my model in that viewport. Basically you want to either make the plane in the viewport that you want to draw in, or turn it on in that viewport. So for example, if I was going to make a plan of this structure, I would turn the clipping plane on in that viewport. I would go to the menu in the viewport, right click and go to set view, go to top, and then I'm ready to make a drawing. So anytime you want to make an orthographic drawing in Rhino, you're going to want to turn it into a line drawing. And the way that we do that is to use the command make 3D. And so that allows me to select any kind of 3D geometry in any kind of view in Rhino and make it into a drawing, even a perspective. But we're just doing orthographics right now. So I'll select my model, again, in the viewport where I have it clipped, if that's the view that I want to make a model of, and press enter on the keyboard. And then I'll get this new panel of options appear. And there's a couple of things that you want to make sure you have selected. One of them is maintain source layers. So basically, if your 3D model is made up of objects that are on multiple layers, mine's not, but if yours is, you want to have that option turned on, because when you make 2D, it'll automatically sort the lines into separate layers based on the layers that the objects were on. The other thing that I want to keep on right now is this option, clipping plane intersection. And that's going to give me a separate line anywhere where my clipping plane is intersecting with my model. In essence, that's going to give me a separate layer every time I want to show like poche or a heavier line weight, right? Because I'm cutting through something. So let me show you what I mean. I'll click OK, and then it should take a few seconds. And the Make 2D will always show up in top view. and it'll always show up near the origin, the 00 point of your file. And it'll always kind of be automatically selected like this. So I'm going to drag it to the side here and move it out of the way. And you'll also notice in your layers panel that some new layers have been created. You'll see a make 2D layer and then a couple of individual layers below that. And so, for example, our clipping plane intersections, if we select those objects on that layer, you can see that it's got a separate line for every part of the strip where the clipping plane is cutting through that strip. And that's great because, like I mentioned, we can easily line weight. That'll make it more easy to line weight. You will notice that on occasion, line weights or lines will be missing, like right here, for example. So make 2D is not perfect, especially when it's looking at objects very kind of oblique to the view. And one of the things you can do to make a make 2D drawing more precise is if you go to units and you adjust the I believe if you adjust the units of the file, for example, if I go from feet to inches, click OK, it'll ask me if I want to scale my model. So obviously, normally I would not want to scale my model, right? Because I'd want it to be the same size, even if it was in different units. But if I wanted to make it bigger by scaling it like that, so now like every foot became an inch. And if I were to make 2D now, you can see that it's a little more precise. So it did capture that line, although it still didn't do it perfectly. So sometimes it's worth it to go to scale your model up, and sometimes it's not. I'm just going to go back to where my scale was before. But that's something to keep in mind. You can change units in order to get more precision out of a make 2D if you're finding a lot of errors with that. So, but this is not too bad. What I would recommend is just draw the line yourself, kind of clean up the drawing yourself. You'll always end up having to do a little bit of cleanup work to make it look precise. Then let's go ahead and make a section as well. So I'll copy this clipping plane, use copy in place to make a duplicate, and I'll rotate it 90 degrees. I'll select that one and turn it on in my current viewport. Front viewport. I'm going to go into shaded so we can kind of see what it looks like cut away. And then, oops. We can kind of position that guy where we want. Oops. But I think actually it's in a pretty good spot right there. Maybe I'll go to like, well, go to right there where we're cutting through that very last strip. Okay, so that's a pretty good view right there. So then what we'd want to do is reset our viewport. I can go to just type in front. If it's not a view that you can type in, you can also go to set view in the command line, go to world, and then you can choose from any number of the ones that are in the drop-down list as well. Front. And then I'm going to do the same thing, make 2D. Select my geometry and press enter. So like I said, it'll only show up in top view. It'll show up in the XY plane, and it'll show up near the origin. So I'll move it to the side again. Okay, and so like before, we have two different layers that were already created beforehand. So if I select my clipping plane intersections, in fact, what I'll do is I'll make the layer a different color so you can more easily see. So those are the, oh, did I not have this? Oh, okay. So what's happening here is I still have my section plane turned on in this viewport, which is why I'm missing part of my drawing there. So that was what was happening there. Anyway, so what I would want to do now is I'd want to go ahead and clean up this drawing and kind of add any additional line weights to just the 2D line work itself. So for example, with this drawing, what we're kind of seeing here is we're seeing the edge of each strip as well as the kind of face of each strip, depending on the orientation of each one. So because this is kind of always rotating, it's pretty complex. It looks pretty complex. what I would recommend doing is like before I would lay this out on a page, before I start editing line weights and stuff, just to get a sense of like what it would look at scale. So I'll go to my layout here, and actually let me remake these so that you see that process. So I would click down here, put a new layout. Again, I'm going to choose Rhino PDF. I would choose Adobe if you don't have that option. I'm going to choose ArcD because that's the paper size that we're using here, 24 by 36. And then it'll automatically create a layout with a detail view. And so what I'll do first, before I do anything else, is set the scale of my detail view. So if I wanted it to be 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, I would just set it to 1 and then 0.25. That's 1/4 inch equals a foot scale for my pavilion. Now, what you'll find, I think, for most of you is that your pavilions will be kind of like this. They won't really take up most of the space. So I think what you're welcome to do is like use the page to show multiple drawings. So with something like a plan, like this one, I might show less detail here, and I might have my section off to one side or something like that. And you can also move these viewports by snapping to the page. So like if we wanted to make sure it's right in the middle of the page, right? We could snap to the midpoint of the edge of the page. Okay, so we know those are kind of divided right along the center of the page. Okay, then we can just position them where we want them. We probably actually also want to leave a little margin between each. But also if you intend to take this out of Rhino before you export it, you don't really have to worry about this. Okay, and then we'll set our viewport to print preview. And so right now, we don't really have any line weights. It looks like we do because there's a double line there in some places, but we don't have any line weights set up. So we want to go through and edit our layers to create line weights. We can edit our print color. This is another way of kind of adding more graphic depth. So under print width in our layers panel, that's where we would go ahead and set up our line weight. And so there we could see, that's where we would add that poche. So we're already generating some depth or some hierarchy with our lines there. The other thing that you might consider doing, we go back to my top view here, is if you wanted to fill, so right here, for example, we're actually looking that's like an edge that's like inside our object. So if I wanted to actually poche the cut line, which means to like fill it in with a hatch or something like that. If I wanted to poche where the section cut is, I could do that in Rhino. So in my model view, I'll turn off my construction lines there, my layer, my other line weight layer. So these should, for the most part, be closed outlines, as long as the geometry we cut through was a closed shape. You can search for those by typing in select open curve. Oh, okay, so I think they're not joined right now, so we could, and that'll actually select all the curves in the whole file that are open. We try and join them and see if that closes them. Now if I go select open curve, there's no object. So we know that all these outlines are closed. And then what I would want to do is hatch them. I'll select all these outlines and I'll just type in the command hatch. And under hatch, we have a bunch of different hatch patterns that we can apply. The one that I'll do here, because it's just a poche, is solid. I'll click OK. Now, it'll make the hatch on whatever layer you are set to currently. What I should have done is I should have made a new layer before I did that and set it to current. However, I can also use the command select last, and select last will select the objects from whatever that were produced by whatever the last command is that I ran. So, for example, this is just selecting my hatches, not the outline, right? I'm going to keep those separate. And then I'll make a new layer and I'll call it hatch. And I'll set these objects to that layer, change object layer. There you go. So now I have them on a separate layer and I can control them independently. Now, if I turn this layer back on, I'll go back to my layout. You can see that my hatches are filling in, like solid filling my my section cut. And if I wanted to change the color of that, I could change the print color of that layer. And so I can kind of emphasize the outline independently from the other lines. Now you can see here that it's actually still showing both lines, which I don't want. So what I can also do is I can go select objects, and I can type in bring to front. Because the line and the hatch are on the same plane, we can change the kind of display order of them on that plane using the same type of commands as you would use in InDesign or in Illustrator. And there we go. So now the outlines are hidden behind that hatch. And I will do the same for my plan. Solid. Again, forgot to change my current layer first, so I'll just change that to my hatch layer. Okay, and then the other thing that might be useful, one of the things that you see a lot in floor plan is to show some information about what's above the plan cut. So in order to do that, I might go back to my top view here where I don't have my model clipped, and I could select my model and go make 2D. Okay, so now I have a separate drawing that I've produced independently. And what I might do now is make another layer, and I'll call this my dash line. And I will position that on top of my plan. And that will allow me to show like the strips that are kind of going overhead of where the plan cut is as a dash line. So what I might also do then is change the line type of that layer. Over here where it says line type, I can click on where it says continuous, and I'll set it to dash. And you can see it might not change really that much in the viewport. If you zoom in on it, you can see it's really, really tiny. But the dash line also has a scale to it. So if we go to our display, our layout, we can see that the dash line actually scale of the dashes looks pretty good. If we want to adjust it, we can go to options, and up at the top here under, under line types, we have a line type scale that we can apply here. So for example, if I know that I'm going from a certain scale in my model to a certain scale in my viewport, I can scale it up over here in model space. So I can go to like 12, make it a little bigger. No, it's actually not changing it. It is changing it. I guess it's just kind of hard to tell. Anyway, so that's how you would make the dash lines appear bigger in model space. However, they're always going to remain the same in layout space in print preview. And that's true too if we change the scale of our drawing. So if I change this to 1/8 of an inch, you can see that the dash lines kind of look more spaced out because the spacing is actually remained the same relative to the scale. So do that. So if I wanted to change the scaling of this dash line, what I could do is I could go to options, I could go to where that dash line is, and then I could make a new pattern for it. I can also add my own line type here. I can rename it to dash line 2. And I can set my own scale for it. So, and these numbers I think correspond to inches as it says here. So if I wanted it to be 1/8 of an inch, I could 0.125 by 0.125, and there's the scale of that dashed line. And then when I apply that, dash line 02, you can see the scaling changes on my layout. So that's how you would show lines above in a plan or behind the section cut in a section. So what I would also do here is I don't ever want to leave any of the line weights set to default or the print widths set to default because that'll actually print at what's called a hairline, which is like super small line. In fact, some printers don't have the resolution to actually show that line weight. So even though it kind of looks okay in my viewport now, like if I were to print it at a normal resolution, which might be like 150 to PDF. Where am I here? Print, test print. And then I open up that. You can see it's actually a really light line. I actually made it a little bit thicker. It doesn't look as bad as I thought. But anyway, the point is you want to actually set it to a specific line weight. I think that may also be because I printed to raster. So when you print stuff, you can print stuff to raster or you can print it to vector. So with raster, it makes the line work into pixels, as you can see here. And with vector, it'll actually print to it'll print to vector artwork, like an Illustrator file. So if I open that guy up, you can see that no matter how far I zoom in, it's going to be nice and sharp. But this can actually be a lot slower. It can be a lot bigger of a file, and it can slow you down a lot more, depending on how many lines and how much detail there is. But anyway, so yeah, you can see here, those lines actually don't look too bad this scale either. But anyway, so I always want to kind of set a line weight for anything that I print, and I'll set it to just the lowest one there. I'll set the same for my dash line, 0.13. Okay, the other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is like how to think about line weighting, multiple things like this, for example, like showing a kind of three-dimensional object. So what we're kind of seeing here is, and this is a good example because it's so kind of confusing and hard to read, really. So it's even with line weights on, it's kind of difficult, for example, to see, okay, yeah, that's a solid strip and that's air, like that's something behind our object, or that's looking through our object, I should say. So one other thing you could do is we could add some additional line weights to this part of the drawing. So not the, shift this up here. I can turn that layer off. So not the poche and not the section cut. But what if I just wanted to line weight the rest of my lines to kind of make these lines look a little bit cleaner? So what I would do is I would make another layer, and I would call this my edges. And in this case, what I would argue is that it's better to kind of emphasize the silhouette of each strip to really kind of understand where we're looking at a solid strip and where we're looking through the object. So what I might do then is go through and select each of the edges that we're looking at that's not like a silhouette line, and set that to a different line weight. So I could do that, first of all, just by selecting the other edges of it. Okay. I'll change that to a different layer. I'll also change the color of that layer so you can see it. Maybe I'll turn it back on and just lock them so I can see better. So basically everywhere where we see an edge rather than a silhouette, like everywhere where we're looking at a corner of the object rather than like where it's kind of touching the air, I'm going to change that to lighter line weight. So this guy should not be on that layer. There should be. Oh no. Nope, that was right. Okay. Okay. The other way. Huh. Okay. So then let's go back to our layout here, and I'll set. So what I may want to do now is give this other line a bit heavier line weight. So I can give this one a smaller line weight. Really kind of see the difference. Change it to black. And so we see there's a subtle difference between those lines, but I mean, I think it's a little bit easier to clearly distinguish like where we're looking at the outline of a strip, where we're looking at kind of the edge of a strip or the corner of a strip. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to cover now is adding like Cad blocks. So if you go to Google and just Google the word Cad block, Cad block is basically like a pre-made drawing of things like furniture, equipment, trees, and people, silhouettes of people. And there's a plethora of free online Cad block websites that you can choose from. They all have many different Cad blocks that can be downloaded. So just find one of these websites and search for the thing you're looking for. So if I'm looking for people, you can see if we can find people in plan. I might actually go with this one because I like the silhouette a little better. And then you can download it. And so when you download a Cad block, you might find that it'll come in a zip file like this. So I will zip it. And then we'll open it up. So it'll come as a DWG most often. Maybe it'll come as a DXF. So those are both AutoCAD file formats. But Rhino can read any of those formats. So we can actually just take this file and drag it right into Rhino. You can also go ahead and actually should be on the view before I do this. You can actually also go to File, Import. So make sure you don't open File because that'll close whatever you're working on. Make sure you go to Import. You can also type import in the command line if you want to. Okay. And the question is always, where did it go? So if we go zoom and go to all, we go to extents. There we go. So you can see my Cad block is way out here, loading in space. I'll first move it closer to where the rest of my stuff is. You can also see it's massive, so I must have chosen the wrong units when I imported it. I'll just scale it by 1 to 12. A little too big. Actually, you know what I should really just do is scale it. So, the kind of standard to use is, 5'10", 6-foot height for a person. So if I make a line here, or I don't even need to make a line, I can just select it all, type in scale, and kind of trace the height of a person. Doesn't have to be perfect. And I'll type in 6 feet there. Okay, I'll move that down. Section is, that's about right. And then the other thing to do here is you'll notice that when you select, or when you bring in Cad blocks, they are a type of object called a block instance. And a block instance means it's kind of like um, a little archive of an object or of a geometry that you can kind of repeat over and over. So for example, if I take this object and move it over here, first of all, you can see that I can't really edit it in a normal way. Like I can't like snap to it. Oh yeah, I guess I couldn't. Anyway, I can't really edit it in a normal way. And that's because like I can't select the outline and the silhouette separately. That's because it's like inside this block. So if I want to edit it, what I need to do is type in the command edit block, or I'm sorry, block edit. And then when I do that, it'll open this little editor window where I can actually see like you can have multiple blocks inside blocks and so on and so forth. So now I'm like inside the block, right? And whatever I do in here will actually affect everything that happens outside the block. So if I change the hatch to a different color, click OK. So first of all, I didn't actually copy it. That's another thing that I wanted to do to show you what I mean. But anyway, so I go in here and I edit the properties of this hatch. So if I go to Object Properties, over here where it says Display Color, what I actually want to do is set that to by layer. So oftentimes with block references, you'll find that they have properties set to them that are not by layer, they're by object or by what's parent, which is like the block layer above it. I'll just set this all to by layer. Okay, so now you can see that the hatch changed to red. But not only did this one change to red, that one did too, right? So like every time I copy this, it's gonna be like an instance of the same object. So whatever I do to one, they'll all change to reflect that. So for example, if I go in here and I delete one of these kids, I'll delete the hatch as well. I'll delete one of these kids, the outline. Okay, and you can see that the other block has changed in an identical way. So it's kind of like referencing the same instance of an object or of a drawing or whatever. Now you can leave them as blocks, and I think that's actually a really useful thing to do for exactly what I just described. Is like if I edit one, they'll all change to reflect those edits. However, what you probably do want to do is go in to the block and then so what happens is like a block can be on a layer. You can see if I select this object, it's on layer 0. That's a new layer that came in from the website I downloaded it from. However, if I double click on this, I can change the line to a different layer. If I change it to that layer edges, click OK. So now you can see that the block is still on that layer. However, if I change, well, I haven't changed the properties of it to by layer. Okay, so the block itself is still on layer 0, but the lines within it are on the layer edges. And if I were to hatch this guy and then put the hatch on the layer hatch, click OK, so you could see that the block the object, the block, is still on the layer 0, but the geometry within the block is on multiple layers. So we can kind of apply multiple properties to it that way. Okay, and so if I go back to my layout here, you can see that those lines now have the property of the layers that they're on, print properties. Okay, and then maybe I'll throw in like some trees as well. So you can search for trees in plane or in elevation. And this is a pretty good set. Some of these files might be really big, so that's something else to watch out for. Okay. So I'll just drag it in. Port. So I think that should stay the same. File is. But we can always scale it if it is. Is. And you can see it's making my file run really slow. One of the things that'll make Rhino run really slow is like a lot of lines. And you can see like all these trees are made up of like hundreds, if not thousands, of individual lines, like so. So the first thing you really want to do is like delete the trees you don't want to use. So I'm going to look for a tree that looks more like a mesquite or a palo verde. I'm also going to look for a tree that doesn't have a ton of detail. So like this, you know, I mean, it looks maybe more like a tree looks in reality because it has kind of a three-dimensionality to it. Like it has darker spots and lighter spots. But I think in an orthographic drawing that can be really distracting. I like to use simple scale figures and simple trees to kind of not distract too much from the actual content of the drawing, which is of course the architecture. So I'm gonna delete everything but that tree in the middle there. There we go. Now my file should be a lot faster. Oh, whoops. Zoom selected. Oh, you can see my tree is really big. So I've still got the units wrong somehow. Anyway, so, and you know, you can scale this to whatever size you want. Say I want a 35-foot tree. There we go. And just like before, you can see that this is actually a block instance. I'm going to double click to go inside the block instance. I'm going to select all the lines. And first of all, just go to by layer for all the properties, the print properties and the display properties. And then I'm also going to change it onto a layer that has the like print properties that I want it to have. I'm going to go for something relatively light. And so you can see there, oh, that's me. You can see there that that it shows kind of in the background. The other thing you could do if you wanted to would be to like have another. So okay, so you can hatch this guy if you want to. You can type in hatch, and because it's not actually like a one closed outline, you can see that there's kind of like lines going past each other and stuff like that. We can hatch it in a different way where we can select this option boundary, select the whole tree, press enter, and then we can kind of click inside the spaces that we want to fill. So you can see it doesn't want to like separate this space with these branches, so we can go with that in a second here. Some of these other guys that are floating out in space. Okay. Enter. Oh, it says self-intersecting loop. So you kind of have to have relatively clean outlines to do this. And the other thing is, you know, like here, for example, the reason it was filling that space in is because this wasn't a closed outline. Or those, you know, like there was a gap between the ends of those lines. Let's try it again here. So yeah, you may actually, well, let me try and just join the outline here and work properly. But I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time fussing with this stuff. If it doesn't work for you, just leave it as lines. Rest of it. Okay. Then we could try and see if we can find, so this is where we would have like what's called a self-intersecting line, where there's like a line crossing over itself, or making like a kind of figure eight. So we want to avoid that. That'll confuse Rhino. Let's see if we can hatch it now. Still no. Yeah, I would just, not spend a ton of time trying to fix it up. You could go through and fix every single line and make sure that you have clean outlines in between things, but it's just not going to be worth your time. There we go. So that worked. Usually it'll work, but anyway, this tree's a little bit. But anyway, so what you could do is also you could make it really light hatch. All this tree layer, and we could even change the print color of this layer to be really light. And I'm going to type my own line weight in here so it's a little thinner. Okay. Put it on that layer. Then you can see it's a lot lighter than it was before. Okay, so that's the kind of basics of getting a detailed 3D model as an orthographic drawing, as well as getting some detail in there to show, like things like scale with the scale figures and some site context, like with things like trees. The other thing that you'll want to include, once you kind of have this a little bit figured out, like for example, how much context am I really going to see in this section and in this plan and so on and so forth. So what I would recommend doing is once you kind of have that figured out, then you also would want to kind of draw a little bit of context to illustrate like what's going on around the object, like on the site and so on and so forth. And so to do that, I'm just going to quickly give you a couple pointers with drawing information from your own images and from information you can find online. So I'm gonna borrow from this site right here. And what I'll do first is I'll actually turn off 3D buildings. Oops, that's layers button here, turn off 3D buildings. So we get just like a more orthographic kind of aerial. I'm gonna make sure I'm oriented north there. Make sure I'm in 2D. Okay. Then I can make a screen grab of this. Snipping. View, snip. Pitch. Okay. And you may also want to measure something in here so we have a point of reference. Scale it by. I'm going to put myself in feet here. Scale like this edge of this building. 194 feet. Okay. So back in Rhino, and I'll just drag in that image. Place it as a picture. First of all, I'll just place it somewhere. Then I'll grab it and scale it. So type in scale. We'll go from that same edge that I measured in Earth. 194. Okay. And so, you should already have kind of some degree of having traced this site But let's say, for example, that I'm just going to place my object right there. I'm going to draw myself a quick boundary so I can kind of have a little bit of reference for how much context I'm really showing in one of my plans. Now, I should point out that the site plan, you'll likely want to do, so you'll want to draw a plan, which is this guy, right? This is showing the thing cut through, the object cut through with more zoomed in to kind of show like the actual space within. But we also want to show a site plan, which would be like kind of the roof plan of our pavilion. And in that plan, we'd be a little more zoomed out. So let me make a new layout really quick to kind of explore how big that would be. And I think that it would make sense to do that at a 1/16 of an inch, which is 0.0625. And we must have some stuff floating out in space still. Get rid of it. Go. So let's get 0.0625 equals 1 foot. Okay. And so we might want to show, I mean, again, we don't have to use the whole page for this, right? It's really up to you how to edit the boundaries. But the point is you might want to show actually a fair bit more context. In fact, I didn't really do this well. I would want to show the library, right? Because that's a really important component of an aerial, or I'm sorry, of this site in a site plan, right? But anyway, so you'd want to kind of use that as a reference to figure out how much of your surroundings to show in the site plan. But what I'm going to do is just use this aerial image to draw some of the context in my plan, cut through plan. So I drew this boundary, and I'll just double check that it's outside of where I see on my layout if it is, and then I'll show like I could choose to trace some of these details like around object. I could draw an arc, I could offset it, I could make sure it was capped, draw that little wall there. Let's just double check. So that's even not in my plan. So to some degree, you might not even find yourself needing to. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong end here. Oh, up here. Okay, so that is a little bit in my plan. And we might see some of these trees. Again, we could download a Cad block to show that. We probably want to show this edge of the sidewalk. And again, this is actually where you'd want to make those kinds of decisions. Like, I think it would be useful even at this scale to show like, yeah, there's a wall or a partial wall there. There's a difference in the ground texture between this grassy area and the paved area. There's a planted area here and a sidewalk below that. So I would actually expand my plan a little bit based on what I'm seeing here in my context to show a little bit more about how it's situated. And then I would go through and I would trace out these lines, and I would, at this scale, I would definitely show, things, details like what's the difference in paving between some of these areas. You'll find, I guess, that's not website. You'll find somewhat better orthographic imagery on Pima maps, at least for Tucson. Aerial satellite imagery. Oh. Okay. Oops. So yeah, so once we're zoomed in on that guy, we might, oh yeah, down here we click layers and we can turn on orthophoto imagery. Oh, I actually chose the wrong place. Home Plaza is where I'm drawing. Anyway, so you can see there's a little more detail there. I guess not a whole lot, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, there's a little more resolution kind of in that image. But anyway, so I would look for things like, in the site plan, you would draw maybe just like the outline of the sidewalk, the difference between different ground areas, and maybe like things like parking lines, street lines, crosswalks, etc. And in the closer plan, you'd want to maybe show things like the texture of the ground. So if this were um, like paved brick, for example, which it is, I'm not sure. Bit of our, oh, that's interesting. Huh, that would happen. There we go. Yeah, so this is actually a brick pattern. So what I would do is I would trace out a little bit of detail in terms of where the um, where we're seeing that sidewalk, and I'm going to not cap this. Okay. So we're seeing a little bit of the sidewalk there, and then I would trace out like where the edges are, the kind of concrete edges that frame the brick. And I could even like array this, something like that, just to kind of give a sense of what's going on there. And then I think the thing to do would be to like show sort of the difference in surface texture, and you can do that by downloading hatch patterns. Go the hatch pattern and find ourselves a website. So here's one that has a pretty good brick pattern, it looks like. I'm actually not going to use the one that there's like a double line because that's a little too much detail. So I downloaded it. It's a .pat file. In order to import a hatch pattern, again, I'm going to go to Options in Rhino, go up here where it says Hatch, and I'm going to go to Import. And I'll go to where I downloaded that thing, open it. And it might be at a scale where you can't really see how big it is. That's it. And I'll set myself to Hatch here. I'm going to do the same thing like I did before. I'm going to use a boundary because these aren't joined outlines, remember? So I'll type in Hatch, and I'll click within the framing of the sidewalk that we drew there. Scroll down in here, and I should see that hatch pattern have appeared. And I can set the pattern scale here. Oh, 1. About right. And then I can also change the rotation. So what I would actually do is just click OK, and I would measure the angle of that so I can really get it accurate. So I can measure an angle by typing in angle. The first line is just going to be straight. The second line is going to be this angle. It's 13.924 degrees. Then I can select each of these hatch patterns that I've drawn before, go to my properties panel, select the hatch button, and I can type in that angle, 13.924. Should pretty much line up my brick. Pretty good. Okay. And so we would be seeing like a little bit of that brick pattern at the edge of our plan as well. So I think that'll be a really important thing to show kind of in plans at a certain scale. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly is like how to draw a little bit of context. So for example, here, let's imagine that we're looking in this direction towards our pavilion, and that there's a couple of like trees, and we're seeing the building and the street behind. For example, if I'm like my plaza or my pavilion's right there, and I'm looking from the plaza in this direction, I would be seeing this building, beyond my plaza. And depending what angle I'm looking at, I should see, of this storefront here, and then maybe some of that up above. So what I want to show you is kind of how to reference Google Earth to get information about how to draw this building. So for one thing, I would start by measuring the height of it. So let me go back to north is up. In Google Earth, I think if we're in 3D, we have our 3D buildings on. I'll go back to my layer. I'll turn on 3D buildings. You can see that we actually can get the relative heights of objects from this viewport. So if we look down in the very bottom right of our viewport there, it's saying 766 meters. And you'll notice when I move my cursor around, that number will change. So we can see that right there, there's a difference of 7 meters between the street height and the height of the building. We move the cursor to the top of the skyscraper, we can see there's quite a bit more difference. So you can actually measure to a decent enough degree of accuracy to show things like context. You can measure like the height of a building. Again, if you were doing really, really detailed work, and or if you were doing some type of work that involved actually like interfacing with any of the context, you'd want to really measure it and get real data. But this is good enough for what we're doing right now. What I'll do is I want to change that number from meters into feet and inches. So click the little 3 dash line up at the top there, go to settings, and if we scroll down here, we'll see units. We can change that into feet and miles. Click save. Okay, so now we're seeing it in feet. And that should actually be like feet above, I think that's like above sea level, although it doesn't seem right. But anyway, so if I hover my cursor over like the height of the street right here, we're at 2,368 feet. And if I hover it above the building, so if I go 392 minus 368, that's the height of my building, 24 feet. So in my plan here, or sorry, in my section here, and this is something that, again, I would just draw this. I wouldn't bother trying to make a model. Maybe you make a model of the, I didn't layer locked here. Maybe you make a model of the like the volume of the building. Like we could model just like a quick mass. For example, we could just quickly trace the outline of this building and like extrude it, just to get a quick reference for how tall it is right there, 24 feet. Okay. And this view is clipped, of course. Anyway, so you could do that kind of thing and kind of model like a mass that way, if you wanted to. And by the way, when you model like outlines like that, if you don't extrude them solid, you can also just select a closed planar extrusion and cap it to make it a closed volume. Anyway, so we could do that to kind of give ourselves a sense of like how big that is. I wouldn't bother modeling like things like windows and mullions and doors and details of the building in your 3D model. I would just draw that stuff. So down here again, I would take that line. So I'll draw my ground plane line. Should have done before anyway. That's actually going to be a thicker line. And then I would offset that by 24. That's the height of my building. And I'm going to change back onto a lighter line right here. And then I would actually just use information that I can get from my street view to kind of look at this building. So, so we know that that edge is about 24 feet. And looking at the building from this direction, a great thing to reference for the heights of things is going to be our doorways, right? Because most of the time they're actually sized to code. So for example, the commercial code for a doorway is 7 feet, and this is almost certainly that size. So I can kind of guess that that this door is 7 feet. And so if I were to take a screen capture of this, I could bring that into Rhino and trace it. So I would also be careful. Just remember that, like, that we're not going to see things like this depth, right, in our elevation. We're going to see that all as straight. Anyway, so let me save this guy. And of course, you don't actually have to trace it. You can also just kind of figure out the dimensions that you think it is and draw that. So I can see up there. I would kind of work from that image, right now. Okay. So then I'll scale it. 7 feet. What I would even do is like take things like if you figure out the spacing of 1 million, for example, I would just copy that spacing rather than try and trace every single one. Offsetting it by the same dimension each time. And we kind of got that a little messed up, so pull it back. Because it'll be less distracting if it's kind of just even rather than it's traced. Okay. And so that image we know is kind of to scale, and the bottom of that door is where the ground is. And let me just go back and reference. So that would be the height of the rest of the okay. That should be about the height of the rest of that facade there. And measure from there to there. It does actually look a little bit big. That's okay. We're just trying to get a rough estimate here. We may also use that to like measure like this distance. Oops. So down below, you can see right there how big my line is. That's 4.5 feet. And then I would just kind of work one bit by bit and figure out, how big each of these subdivisions is. And and you could even get that correct. So that edge of this little storefront, and that looks smaller than this one. 3 3/4. Okay, and I mean, it's unlikely you would even need to show the entire building, but you could kind of trace out like the larger areas. Go over here, for example. Kind of trace out like where these columns are, for example. Use that as a reference to begin to fill in like different areas. You needed to draw the whole thing and make it proportional. So I would draw maybe the rest of this. So there's another set. Booleans go all the way down. Okay, I might even put these on a lighter line. Good. Extend them all. Okay. And what I'm trying to show here is just to demonstrate that, like, if we were going to show this stuff behind, we would also want to make sure that we're not looking kind of through our drawing of our object at the stuff behind it, right? So what I would also do here is I would hide this stuff temporarily. Another layer. Yeah, it'll be good to keep context on different layers. You want it to be lighter line weights anyway. But anyway, so I would hide this. And then going back to my drawing here, and I'm going to this as well actually. Going back to just my base drawing, what I could also do now is I could hatch it. And what I might do is just hatch the whole thing. So when you do hatch and you do like boundary like that, like what I just did, so I'll type in hatch. See our option is set to boundary. It'll say select curve, so those are the curves I want to hatch. Press enter. And then if I just want it to hatch everything that it can possibly fill in, that has a closed outline, I can just click out in space somewhere and it'll fill everything. And then I just got to go through and kind of unfill areas where we would actually see through it. That yours is a little simpler than mine. That. That. Okay. Center. I'm going to make this a solid. Okay. Then I'm going to go to select last, and I'm going to make another new layer, and I'm going to call this my background hatch. And what I'm actually going to do is select it and go send to back, and I'm going to set it to print white. And then if I bring back everything else, like context and so on, so these lines I also want to send to back, and all those lines. And I'll do that after I sent my hatch to back, so that they should end up behind that hatch. And when I go look, going on. So what that will do is it'll make it look like, we're blocking out the background wherever we're not looking through it towards the building. And I would do the same thing for my tree there as well. I would block out or actually, you could block it out or you could trim it. I think in the case of this example, it'd be easier to hatch. But if you didn't have your trees hatched and you just wanted to get rid of this line up here, that's pretty easy to do. I select this guy and we trim that right away. You can do one or the other, up to you. And there we go. We have a kind of cohesive looking section with some background context and so on. Okay, so I think that'll pretty much be end of this video. we'll cover anything else that that may come up next week.